Section 13 of the Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Chronicles of Newgate, Volume 1, by Arthur Griffiths. Section 13. Newgate in the 18th Century, Part 2. The passion for gaming, again, the school in which most highwaymen of great eminence have been bred, was a fruitful source of immoral degeneracy. Every one gambled. In the Gentleman's Magazine for 1731 there is the following entry: "At night their Majesties played for the benefit of the groom porter, and the King, George II, and Queen, each won several hundreds, and the Duke of Grafton several thousands of pounds." His Majesty's lieges followed his illustrious example, and all manner of games of chance with cards or dice, such as hazard, faro, basset, roly-poly, were the universal diversion in clubs, public places, and private gatherings. The law had thundered, but to no purpose, against this destructive vice, inflicting fines on those who indulged in it, declaring securities won at play void, with other penalties, yet gaming throve and flourished. It was fostered and encouraged by innumerable hells, which the law in vain strove to put down. Nightly raids were made upon them. In the same number of the Gentleman's Magazine as that just quoted, it is recorded that "the High Constable of Holborn searched a notorious gaming house behind Gray's Inn Road, but the gamesters were fled, only the keeper was arrested and bound over for £200." Again, I find in Wade's Chronology that "Justice Fielding, having received information of a rendezvous of gamesters in the Strand, procured a strong party of the Guards, who seized 45 of the tables, which they broke to pieces, and carried the gamesters before the justice. Under each of the broken tables were observed 2 iron rollers and 2 private springs, which those who were in the secret could touch and stop the turning whenever they had flats to deal with." No wonder these establishments throve. They were systematically organized, and administered by duly appointed officers. There was the commissioner, who checked the week's accounts and pocketed the takings; a director to superintend the room; an operator to deal the cards; and 4 to 5 croupiers, who watched the cards and gathered in the money of the bank. Besides these, there were puffs, who had money given them to decoy people to play; a clerk and a squib, who were spies upon the straight dealings of the puffs; a flasher to swear how often the bank was stripped; a dunner to recover sums lost; a waiter to snuff candles and fill in the wine; and an attorney or Newgate solicitor. A flash captain was kept to fight gentlemen who were peevish about losing their money. At the door was a porter, generally a soldier of the Foot Guards, who admitted visitors after satisfying himself that they were of the right sort. The porter had aides de camp and assistants, an orderly man, who patrolled the street and gave notice of the approaching constables; a runner, who watched for the meetings of the justices and brought intelligence of the constables being out; and a host of link boys, coachmen, chairmen, drawers to assist, with common bail affidavit men, ruffians, bravos, and assassins for any odd job that might turn up, requiring physical strength. As the years passed the vice grew in magnitude. Large fortunes were made by the proprietors of gaming houses, thanks to the methodized employment of capital, invested regularly as in any other trading establishment, the invention of E.O. tables, and the introduction of the foreign games of roulette and rouge et noir. Little short of £1 million must have been amassed in this way, individuals having acquired from £10,000 to £100,000 apiece. The number of the gambling establishments daily multiplied. They were mounted regardless of expense. open house was kept, and free luxurious dinners laid for all comers. Merchants and bankers' clerks entrusted with large sums were especially encouraged to attend. The cost of entertainment in one house alone was £8,000 for 8 months, while the total expenditure on all as much as £150,000 a year. The gambling house keepers, often prize fighters originally, or partners admitted for their skill in card sharping or cocking dice, possessed such ample funds that they laughed at legal prosecutions. Witnesses were suborned, officers of justice bribed, informers intimidated. Armed ruffians and bludgeon men were employed to barricade the houses, and resist the civil power. Private competed with public hells. Great ladies of fashion, holding their heads high in the social world, made their drawing rooms into gambling places, into which young men of means were enticed and despoiled. This was called pigeoning, probably the first use of the expression. The most noted female gamesters were Lady Buckinghamshire, Lady Archer, Lady Mount Edgecombe, a trio who had earned for themselves the sobriquet of Pharaoh's Daughters. Their conduct came under severe reprehension of Lord Kenyon, who, in summing up a gambling case, warned them that if they came before him in connection with gambling transactions, though they should be the first ladies of the land, they should certainly exhibit themselves in the pillory. This well-merited threat was reproduced in various caricatures of the day, under such heads as "Ladies of elevated rank," "Pharaoh's Daughters, beware," "Discipline à la Kenyon." The government itself was in a measure responsible for the diffusion of the passion for gambling. The pernicious custom of public lotteries practically legalized this baneful vice. State lotteries began in the reign of Elizabeth, and existed down to 1826. They brought in a considerable revenue, but they did infinite mischief by developing the rage for speculation, which extended to the whole community. The rich could purchase whole tickets, or great goes. For the more impecunious, the tickets were subdivided into little goes. Those who had no tickets at all could still gamble at the lottery insurance offices by backing any particular number to win. The demoralization was widespread. It reached a climax in the South Sea bubble, when thousands and thousands were first decoyed, then cruelly deceived and beggared. But lotteries lingered on till the government at length awoke to the degradation of obtaining an income from such a source. While crime thus stalked rampant through the land, the law was nearly powerless to grapple and check it. It had practically but one method of repression, the wholesale removal of convicted offenders to another world. Prevention, as we understand it, had not yet been invented. The metropolis, with its ill-paved, dimly lighted streets, was without police protection beyond that afforded by a few feeble watchmen, the sorely tried and often nearly useless Charlies. The administration of justice was defective. The justices had not sufficient powers. They were frequently as regardless of the law as ignorant of it, or else were defied by pettifoggers and people with money in their pockets. A mob of chairmen or servants, or a gang of thieves, were almost too big for the civil authority to repress, and the civil power generally, according to Fielding, was in a lethargic state. The private enterprise of citizens had sought for some time past to second the efforts of the state, and various societies for the reformation of manners laboured hard, but scarcely with marked success, to reduce crime. The first of these societies originated in the previous century, by 6 private gentlemen, whose hearts were moved by the dismal and desperate state of the country to engage in the difficult and dangerous enterprise, and it was soon strengthened by the addition of persons of eminency in the law, members of Parliament, justices of the peace, and considerable citizens of London of known abilities and great integrity. There was a second society of about 50 persons, tradesmen and others, and a third society of constables, who met to consider how they might best discharge their oaths, a fourth to give information, while other bodies of householders and officers assisted in the great work. These in 1 year, 1724, had prosecuted over 2500 persons, and in the 33 years preceding nearly 90,000, while in the same period they have given away 400,000 good books. However well meant were these efforts, it is to be feared that they were of little avail in stemming the torrent of crime which long continued to deluge the country. The character of offences perpetrated will best be understood by passing from the general to the particular, and briefly indicating the salient points of a certain number of typical cases, all of which were in some way or other connected with Newgate. Crime was confined to no one class. While the lowest robbed with brutal violence, members of the highest stabbed and murdered each other on flimsy pretences, or found funds for debauchery in systematic and cleverly contrived frauds. Life was held very cheap in those days. Every one with any pretensions carried a sword, and appealed to it on the slightest excuse or provocation. Murderous duels and affrays were of constant occurrence. So-called affairs of honour could only be washed out in blood. Sometimes it was a causeless quarrel in a club or coffee–house ending in a fatal encounter. Richard Savage, the poet, was tried for his life for a murder of this kind in 1727. In company with 2 friends, all 3 of them being the worse for drink, he forced his way into a private room in Robinson's coffee–house near Charing Cross, occupied by another party carousing. One of Savage's friends kicked down the table without provocation. "What do you mean by that?" cried one side. "What do you mean?" cried the other. Swords were drawn, and a fight ensued. Savage, who found himself in front of one Sinclair, made several thrusts at his opponent, and ran him through the body. Lights were put out, and Savage tried to escape, but was captured in a back court. He and his associates were committed first to the Gatehouse, and thence to Newgate. 3 weeks later they were arraigned at the Old Bailey, found guilty of murder, and cast for death. The king's pardon was, however, obtained for Savage through the intercession of influential friends, but contrary, it is said, to the expressed wish of his mother. Savage was tried before Sir Francis Page, commonly known as the hanging judge. He afterwards admitted that he had been anxious to hang Savage. In his old age, when his health was inquired after, he is reported to have replied, "I keep hanging on, hanging on." Savage was the illegitimate child of the Countess of Macclesfield, the fruit of a guilty intrigue with Captain Richard Savage, afterwards Earl Rivers. Lady Macclesfield was divorced, and subsequently married Earl Rivers, but she conceived a violent hatred for the child, and only consented to settle an annuity of £50 upon him, when grown to man's estate, under threat of exposure in the first publication of Savage's poems. Savage, after his release from Newgate, retired into Wales, but he continued in very distressed circumstances, and being arrested for debt, lingered for the remainder of his days in Bristol gaol. The case of Major Oneby is still more typical of the times. He was a military officer who had served in Marlborough's wars, and not without distinction, although enjoying an evil reputation as a duellist. When the army lay in winter quarters at Bruges he had been "out," and had killed his man. Again in Jamaica he had wounded an adversary who presently died. After the Peace of Utrecht Major Oneby was placed on half pay, and to eke out his narrow means he became a professional gambler, being seldom without cards and dice in his pocket. He was soon known as a swaggerer and a bully, with whom it was wisest not to quarrel. One night in 1727, however, he was at play in the Castle Tavern in Drury Lane, when a Mr. Gower and he fell out about a bet. Oneby threw a decanter at Gower, and Gower returned the fire with a glass. Swords were drawn, but at the interposition of others put up again. Gower was for making peace, but Oneby sullenly swore he would have the other's blood. When the party broke up, he called Gower into another room and shut the door. A clashing of swords was heard within. The waiter broke open the door, and the company rushed in to find Oneby holding up Gower with his left hand, having the sword in his right. Blood was seen streaming through Gower's waistcoat, and his sword lay upon the floor. Some one said to Oneby, "You have killed him." But the major replied, "No, I might have done if I would, but I have only frightened him," adding that if he had killed him in the heat of passion, the law would have been on his side. But his unfortunate adversary did actually die of his wound the following day, whereupon Major Oneby was apprehended and locked up in Newgate. He was tried the following month at the Old Bailey, but the jury could not decide as to the exact measure of the major's guilt, except that it was clear he had given the first provocation, while it was not denied he had killed the deceased. A special verdict was agreed to, and the case with its various points referred to the 12 judges. The prisoner, who had hoped to escape with a conviction of manslaughter, was remanded to Newgate, and remained there in the State side, without judgment, for the space of 2 years. Becoming impatient, he prayed the Court of King's Bench that counsel might be heard in his case, and he was accordingly brought into court before the Lord Chief Justice Raymond, when his counsel and those for the Crown were fully heard. The judge reserved his judgment till he had consulted his 11 brethren, but the major, elated at the ingenious arguments of his lawyer, fully counted upon speedy release. On his way back to gaol, he entertained his friends at a handsome dinner given at the Crown and Anchor Tavern. He continued to carouse and live high in Newgate for several months more, little doubting the result of the judges' conference. They met after considerable delay in Serjeant's Inn Hall. Counsel was heard on both sides, and the pleadings lasted a whole day. A friend called in the evening and told him, when he was making merry over a bowl of punch, that 11 of the judges had decided against him. This greatly alarmed him. Next day the keeper of Newgate, Mr. Akerman, came to put irons on him, unless he was prepared to pay for a special keeper to occupy the same room. Oneby was indignant, but helpless. He felt the ground slipping from under his feet, and he was almost prepared for the judgment delivered in open court that he had been guilty of murder, his threat that he would have Gower's blood having had great weight in his disfavour. Oneby spent the days before execution in 1729 in fruitless efforts to get relations and friends to use their influence in obtaining pardon for him. But he was so overbearing that his relations would not visit him in Newgate, and his friends, if he had any, would not stir a finger to help him. His last moments seem to have been spent between laughing at the broad jokes of his personal gaoler, who now never left him, one John Hooper, afterwards public executioner, and fits of rage against those who had deserted him in his extremity. He was further exasperated by a letter from an undertaker in Drury Lane, who, having heard that the major was to die on the following Monday, promised to perform the funeral as cheap and in as decent a manner as any man alive. Another cause of annoyance was the publication of a broadsheet entitled "The Weight of Blood, or the Case of Major John Oneby," the writer of which had visited the prisoner ostensibly to offer to suppress the publication, but really as an interviewer to obtain some additional facts for his catchpenny pamphlet. The major was so indignant that he laid a trap for the author by inviting him to revisit Newgate, promising himself the pleasure of thrashing him when he appeared, but the man declined to be caught. On the Saturday night before execution, Oneby, learning that a petition had been presented and rejected, prepared to die. He slept soundly till 4 in the morning, then, calling for a glass of brandy and writing materials, he wrote his will. It was brief, and to the following effect: "Cousin Turville, give Akerman for the turnkey below stairs half a guinea, and Jack Hooper, who waits in my room, 5 shillings. The poor devils have had a great deal of trouble with me since I have been here." After this he begged to be left to sleep, but a friend called about 7. The major cried feebly to his servant, "Philip, who is that?" and it was found that he was bleeding to death from a deep gash in his wrist. He was dead before a surgeon could be called in. In these disastrous affrays both antagonists were armed, but reckless roisterers and swaggering bobadils were easily provoked, and they did not hesitate, in a moment of mad passion, to use their swords upon defenceless men. Bailiffs and the lesser officers of justice were especially obnoxious to these high-tempered bloods. I read in Luttrell, under date February 1698, "Captain Dancy of the Guards killed a bailiff in Exeter Street, and is committed to Newgate." Again, in 1705, "Captain Carleton, formerly a justice of the peace for Middlesex, is committed to Newgate for running a marshal's man through the body, who endeavoured to arrest him on the parade by the Horse Guards in St. James's Park, of which wound it is thought the man will die." I can find no mention of the fate which overtook these murderers, but the calendars contain a detailed account of another murder of much the same kind, that perpetrated by the Marquis de Paleotti upon his servant John Nicolo, otherwise John the Italian, in 1718. The Marquis had come to England to visit his sister, who had married the Duke of Shrewsbury in Rome, and had launched out into a career of wild extravagance. The Duchess had paid his debts several times, but at length declined to assist him further. He was arrested and imprisoned, but his sister privately procured his discharge. After his enlargement, being without funds, the Marquis sent Nicolo to borrow what he could, but "the servant having met with frequent denials, declined going, at which the Marquis drew his sword and killed him on the spot." The Marquis seems to have hoped to have found sanctuary at the Bishop of Salisbury's, to whose house he repaired as soon as Nicolo's body was found. But he was arrested there after having behaved so rudely that his sword, all bloody with gore, had to be taken from him, and he was conveyed to Newgate. His defence was weak, his guilt clear, and much to his surprise he was sentenced to be hanged. He declared that it was disgraceful "to put a nobleman to death like a common malefactor for killing a servant." But his plea availed little, and he suffered at Tyburn 5 weeks after the murder. 40 years later an English nobleman, Earl Ferrers, paid the same extreme penalty for murdering his steward. His lordship was tried by his peers, and after sentence until his execution was lodged in the Tower and not in Newgate. His case is sufficiently well known, and has already been briefly referred to. Another aristocratic miscreant, whose crimes only fell short of murder, was Colonel Francis Charteris. Well born, well educated, well introduced into life, he joined the army under Marlborough in the Low Countries as a cornet of horse, and soon became noted as a bold and dexterous gambler. His greed and rapacity were unbounded. He lent money at usurious rates to those whom he had already despoiled of large sums by foul play, and having thus ruined many of his brother officers, he was brought to trial, found guilty of disgraceful conduct, and sentenced by court-martial to be cashiered. On his way back to Scotland, by falsely swearing he had been robbed at an inn, he swindled the landlord out of a large sum of money, as an indemnity, and does not seem to have been called to account for his fraud. In spite of his antecedents, Charteris obtained a new commission through powerful friends, and was soon advanced to the grade of colonel. Moving in the best society, he extended his gambling operations, and nearly robbed the Duchess of Queensberry of £3000 by placing her near a mirror, so that he could see all her cards. Escaping punishment for this, he continued his depredations till he acquired a considerable fortune and several landed estates. Fate overtook him at last, and he became the victim of his own profligacy. Long notorious as an unprincipled and systematic seducer, he effected the ruin of numbers by means of stratagems and bribes. but was at length arrested on a charge of criminal assault. He lay in Newgate on the State side, lightly ironed, and enjoying the best of the prison until the trial at the Old Bailey in February 1730. He was convicted and sentenced to die, but through the strenuous exertions of his son-in-law, the Earl of Wemyss, obtained the king's pardon. He died 2 years later, miserably, in Edinburgh, whither he had retired after his release. He was long remembered with obloquy. Dr. Arbuthnot, who wrote his epitaph, has best depicted his detestable character as a villain, "who with an inflexible constancy and inimitable impunity of life persisted, in spite of age and infirmity, in the practice of every human vice except prodigality and hypocrisy, his insatiable avarice exempting him from the first, and his matchless impudence from the latter; and who, having done every day of his life something worthy of a gibbet, was once condemned to one for what he had not done." Dr. Arbuthnot appears from this to have dissented from the verdict of the jury by which Charteris was tried. In times of such general corruption it was not strange that a deplorable laxity of morals should prevail as regards trusts, whether public or private. Even a Lord Chancellor was found guilty of venal practices, the sale of offices, and the misappropriation of funds lodged in the Chancery Court. This was the 12th Earl of Macclesfield, who sought thus dishonestly to mend his fortunes, impaired, it was said, by the South Sea bubble speculations. He was tried before his peers, found guilty, and declared for ever incapable of sitting in Parliament, or withholding any office under the Crown, and further sentenced to a fine of £30,000, with imprisonment in the Tower until it was paid. Lord Macclesfield promptly paid his fine, which was but a small part of the money he had amassed by his speculations, and was discharged, "to the disgrace of the times in which he lived," says the biographer of Lord Hardwicke. "The infamy with which he had been thus covered debarred him neither from the favour of the great, nor even from that of his sovereign." Various cases of embezzlement by public officials previous to this are mentioned by Luttrell. Frauds upon the Exchequer and upon persons holding Government annuities were not infrequent. The first entry in Luttrell is dated 1697, May, and is to the effect that "Mr. Marriott, an underteller in the Exchequer, arrested for altering an Exchequer bill for £10 to £100, pleaded innocency, but is sent to Newgate." Others were implicated, and a proclamation was issued offering a reward for the apprehension of Domingo Ortumez, a Portuguese, Robert Marriott, and another for counterfeiting Exchequer bills. A little later another teller, Mr. Darby, is sent to Newgate on a similar charge, and in that prison Mr. Marriott "accuses John Knight, Esquire, MP, Treasurer of Customs, who is displaced." Marriott's confession follows: "He met Mr. Burton and Mr. Knight at Somerset House, where they arranged to get 20 per cent. by making Exchequer bills specie bills. They offered Marriott £500 a year to take all upon himself if discovered. It is thought greater people are in it to destroy the credit of the nation." Following this confession, bills were brought into the House of Commons charging Burton, Knight, and Duncombe with embezzlement, but "blanks are left for the House to insert the punishment, which is to be either fine, imprisonment, or loss of estates." Knight was found guilty of endorsing Exchequer bills falsely, but not of getting money thereby. Burton was found guilty. Duncombe's name is not mentioned, and Marriott was discharged. But this does not end the business. In the May following, "Mr. Ellers, master of an annuity office in the Exchequer, was committed to Newgate for forging people's hands to their orders, and receiving a considerable sum of money thereon." Again in October, "Bellingham, an old offender, was convicted of felony in forging Exchequer bills, and a Mrs. Butler also for forging a bond of £20,000 payable by the executors of Sir Robert Clayton 6 years after his death." Later on (1708) I find an entry in Luttrell that Justice Lieut, who was a commissioner of the Stamp Office, was committed to Newgate for counterfeiting stamps, which others whom he informed against distributed. Of the same character as the foregoing was the offence of Mr. Lemon, a clerk in the Pell Office of the Exchequer, who received £300 in the name of a gentlewoman deceased, and kept it, for which he was turned out of his place. Other unfaithful public servants were to be found in other departments. Robert Lowther, Esq., was taken into custody on the 25th of October, 1721, by order of the Privy Council, for his tyrannical and corrupt administration when governor of the island of Barbadoes. 20 years later the House of Commons fly at still higher game, and commit the Solicitor of the Treasury to Newgate for refusing to answer questions put to him by the secret committee which sat to inquire into Sir Robert Walpole's administration. This official had often been charged with the Prime Minister's secret disbursements, and he was accused of being recklessly profuse. Section 14